Welcome to the anatomy of an artificial mind, where we deconstruct the foundational technology of modern AI, the neural network. At first glance, this diagram looks complex, but it's just a highly organized system of simple mathematical operations. Our journey begins by understanding this structure. At the far left, we have the input layer. This is where raw data or features enters the network, perhaps pixels from an image or features from a dataset. Each piece of data is an input signal flowing into the system. The core work happens in the hidden layers, which consist of numerous processing units, or artificial neurons. These layers extract increasingly abstract features from the input. For instance, the first hidden layer might detect edges in an image, while subsequent layers combine those edges to recognize shapes like eyes or noses. Notice the lines connecting the neurons. These are the synaptic weights. Every connection has an associated weight, which is an adjustable parameter the network uses to learn. It determines how important one neuron's output is to the next neuron's input. The calculation within each neuron involves weighted processing and activation, summing up all the weighted inputs it receives and then applying a mathematical function to decide its output. Information moves sequentially from left to right through this structure, a process called forward propagation. This flow eventually reaches the output layer, which produces the resultant output or decision prediction. If the network is classifying images, the output might tell us whether the input was a cat or a dog. Understanding the role of the input, the flow of the weights, and the function of the processing units is essential to grasping how an artificial mind learns to interpret the world. This entire mechanism, while complex in scale, is built from the simplest computational components we will explore next. To truly appreciate the neural network, we must understand its origins. It all started with a biological blueprint, the human neuron. Machine learning didn't invent the concept of a learning structure. It simply digitized and simplified the one nature already perfected. On the left, we see the biological neuron. It's a sophisticated cell communicating through chemistry and electricity. The branching structures, the dendrites, serve as the inputs, receiving chemical signals, neurotransmitters from thousands of other neurons. These signals travel to the cell body, the soma, which acts as the processor. The soma integrates or sums all these signals. If the accumulated signal exceeds a specific electrical threshold, the neuron fires, sending a new electrical signal down the axon, which is the neuron's output structure, ready to transmit to the next cell. This is fundamentally a process of signal integration and threshold-based decision-making. Now look at the artificial neuron on the right. We abstract the three key ideas from biology, transforming them into mathematics. 1. Inputs are numerical values coming from other neurons or the raw data. 2. Integration is represented by the summation symbol, $sigma$, where we sum all the incoming weighted signals. And 3. Activation is the rule, usually a nonlinear function, that decides whether the neuron should fire an output signal, and if so, how strong that signal should be. It is crucial to note that the artificial neuron is inspired by biology, but it is not a direct copy. We strip away the complexity of electrochemical processes and retain only the core functional steps: receive, process, and transmit. This functional similarity allows us to build powerful computational models. For context, the map of all neuronal connections in an individual is called their connectome, highlighting just how complex and unique these biological networks are, a complexity we try to capture digitally. The first significant attempt to create an artificial neuron came in 1957 with the Perceptron, developed by Frank Rosenblatt. It represented the first simplified mathematical model capable of performing a basic classification task. While primitive by today's standards, it laid the entire groundwork for modern neural networks. The perceptron operates in 3 distinct sequential steps, converting inputs into a binary output, +1 or -1. First, we have the weighted sum. Each input value, W1, W2, W3, W4, etc., is multiplied by its corresponding weight. As we established, these weights are the adjustable parameters learned during training. They determine the importance of that specific input. If a weight is large, that input contributes more significantly to the final decision. Second, we perform integration. This is simply adding all those weighted inputs together. This gives us a single numerical value representing the total accumulated signal received by the neuron. Third, and most critically for the perceptron, we apply the threshold. The integrated sum is compared against a fixed threshold, which Rosenblatt often set to 0. If the sum is greater than the threshold, the neuron fires and outputs +1. Otherwise, it outputs -1. This means the perceptron is fundamentally a binary classifier, used to separate data into two classes. The historical implementation of this idea is fascinating. The first hardware version, the Mark I Perceptron in 1958, was literally the size of a refrigerator and used physical electric motors to turn knobs that manually adjusted its weights. This early machine demonstrated that learning could be mechanized, even if the math was still quite basic. Despite the initial enthusiasm surrounding the perceptron, its inherent simplicity ultimately led to its downfall and ushered in a decades-long decline in AI research, famously known as the first AI winter. The problem stemmed from what we call the perceptron's fatal flaw. It is limited to solving only linearly separable problems. Look at the diagram on the left. If we have two clusters of data, represented by blue dots and red squares, and we can draw a single straight line to completely separate them, the problem is linearly separable. A single perceptron, with its simple summation and threshold mechanism, is perfectly capable of finding that line and classifying the data correctly. However, most interesting real-world problems are not this straightforward. Consider the diagram on the right, which illustrates a non-linearly separable problem. Here, the blue dots are encircled by the red squares. No matter where you draw a single straight line, you cannot completely separate the two classes. Problems like the logical XOR function, which requires a nonlinear decision boundary, proved impossible for the perceptron to solve. A pivotal moment arrived in 1969 when Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert published the book Perceptrons. They rigorously proved this fundamental theoretical limit. A single perceptron was incapable of solving nonlinear problems. This revelation shattered the optimism around neural networks. The conclusion was that the approach was a dead end. Enthusiasm and funding rapidly dried up, leading to the AI winter, a period that lasted roughly from the 1970s through the 1990s, where neural network research largely stalled. The limitations of the perceptron were eventually overcome by two seemingly small, yet mathematically revolutionary, changes. These modifications transformed the original perceptron into the versatile building block of modern deep learning systems, the modern neuron. If we follow the evolution shown on the slide, the first key addition is the bias. In the add bias model, we introduce a new, independent input that is not connected to other neurons or previous layer outputs. Think of it as a constant, internally generated input for the neuron. What does the bias do? Mathematically, it allows the entire summation and decision boundary to be shifted globally, independent of the weighted inputs. Imagine our straight line from the perceptron slide. The weights determine the slope of the line, but the bias determines where the line intercepts the axis, allowing the neuron to shift its decision boundary around the feature space. This makes the neuron significantly more flexible and adaptive. The second, and arguably more profound, change is the replacement of the simple +1 threshold with a generalized activation function. In the final diagram, instead of a rigid, hard cutoff threshold, we incorporate a sophisticated mathematical function. This function allows for a wider range of outputs, not just +1 or -1, and most crucially, it introduces nonlinearity. This is the secret ingredient that solves the perceptron's fatal flaw. By introducing nonlinearity, we allow a network of these neurons to model complex, curved decision boundaries, making it possible to solve those previously impossible non-linearly separable problems and escape the collapse we will soon discuss. With the modern neuron defined, we now turn to the process of assembling the machine, from neurons to layered networks. Modern deep learning achieves its power not through the complexity of a single neuron, but through the complexity of arranging many simple neurons into deep, structured layers. First, let's define the architecture we are looking at. This is a feed-forward network. Information flows in only one direction, from the inputs, through the hidden layers, and finally to the output. There are no loops or feedback mechanisms in this basic structure, hence feed-forward. These structures are defined by layers, where neurons are organized sequentially. The input layer receives raw data, such as the pixels of an image. The hidden layers process the outputs from the previous layer. This layered approach is vital because it allows the network to handle data hierarchically. Each layer learns more abstract, higher-level features from the representations built by the layer before it, leading to powerful pattern recognition capabilities. The term deep learning simply refers to a neural network that contains multiple hidden layers. This depth is what allows the network to achieve state-of-the-art results in fields like image recognition and language processing, as it can build profound hierarchical representations. Finally, the structure shown here is known as a fully connected layer, or dense layer. This is a common structure where every neuron in one layer receives an input from every single neuron in the previous layer, ensuring that all possible information pathways are considered during the processing step. Before we proceed further, we must address a fundamental question that troubled early AI researchers. The puzzle, why most networks should collapse. This puzzle explains precisely why simply stacking perceptrons wouldn't work, even if we added dozens of layers. Let's examine a simplified network structure where neurons C, D, E, F, and G perform only a simple weighted sum of their inputs, entirely without the special activation function we just discussed. This means all operations are strictly linear, just multiplication and addition. Input A and input B flow into the first hidden layer, C and D. The outputs of C and D are straightforward linear equations based on A and B. For example, the output of C is 2A plus 4B, following the weights WAC equals $2 and WBC equals $4. Similarly, the output of D is 3A plus 5B. Now, look at the next layer, E and F. The output of E is 6C plus 8D, meaning it's a linear combination of the linear outputs of C and DF is also a linear combination of C and D. Finally, the network attempts to produce the output of G, which is 10E plus 11F. We have a linear combination of linear combinations of linear combinations. The question we must ask ourselves is, with this multi-layered network performing only addition and multiplication, what is it actually computing? Does the depth of these three layers actually give us complex computational power, or is it merely creating computational illusion? The answer to the puzzle is revealed in the math. They all collapse into a single neuron. The critical realization is that a network composed only of linear functions, simple addition and multiplication, is fundamentally redundant. Regardless of its apparent depth or the number of neurons, it can always be reduced to a single, mathematically equivalent neuron. Let's look at the math revealed. We start with the final output G, defined by E and F. G equals 10E plus 11F. We then substitute the expressions for E and F, which are defined by C and D, and subsequently, we substitute C and D, which are defined directly by the inputs A and B when we perform this massive substitution and simplify the entire algebraic expression. Something remarkable happens. G equals 10, 6C plus 8D, plus 11, 7C plus 9D. G equals 10, 6, 2A plus 4B, plus 8, 3A plus 5B, plus 11, 7, 2A plus 4B, plus 9, 3A plus 5B. If you work through the arithmetic, distributing the terms, collecting the A's and collecting the B's, the complex, multi-layered equation simplifies dramatically into G equals 60A plus 80B. This entire three-layer, 5-neuron network is mathematically identical to a single, simple perceptron receiving inputs A and B with weights of 60 and 80, respectively. The depth adds no computational advantage. This is why multi-layer neural networks failed during the first AI winter. Without the ability to model nonlinear relationships, they simply collapsed into their simplest, linear form, possessing no more power than the original limited perceptron. This brings us to the secret ingredient, nonlinearity. If linear operations cause our network to collapse, then to prevent that collapse, we must intentionally break the simple chain of linear mathematics. We do this by applying an activation function immediately after the weighted sum in every single neuron. An activation function is a nonlinear operation applied to the output of each neuron's summation step. What does nonlinear mean in this context? It means the relationship cannot be described merely by addition and multiplication. These nonlinear functions introduce mathematical kinks into the processing pipeline. Why are these kinks so crucial? They are what endow a deep network with its immense power. They prevent the layers from collapsing into that single, equivalent linear model we just observed. By applying a nonlinear function at every step, the output of layer 1 cannot be simply combined with the output of layer 2 to form a single, shallow function. This allows the network to successfully model complex, nonlinear relationships and high-dimensional curves found in real-world data. Think of it using the visual analogy. We start with a rigid pole representing a linear function. The introduction of the joint, which represents the nonlinearity, allows that pole to bend and form complex shapes. Without the joint, the pole can only create a straight line. The introduction of nonlinearity is the singular mathematical mechanism that allowed neural networks to move past the limitations of the perceptron and finally unlock the era of deep learning. The choice of the nonlinear activation function is a major design decision in building a neural network, and researchers have developed an entire gallery of these functions, each optimized for different circumstances. Here are 4 of the most common ones we encounter today. First, the ReLU or rectified linear unit. This is currently the default workhorse for most hidden layers. It is incredibly simple, fast to compute, and highly effective. Its definition is straightforward. If the input is negative, it outputs 0, effectively silencing the neuron. If the input is positive, it simply outputs the input value itself. This simplicity helps with rapid training. Next, we have the leaky ReLU, an improvement designed to mitigate a problem inherent in standard ReLU called the dying neuron problem. Because ReLU outputs 0 for all negative inputs, a neuron can sometimes get stuck in a state where it never activates again, effectively dying during training. Leaky ReLU solves this by allowing a small, non-zero gradient, like 0.01x, when the input is negative. This slight leak keeps the neuron responsive and helps optimization. Moving to the bottom row, the sigmoid function was historically very important, especially in older network architectures. It squashes the entire range of inputs, from negative infinity to positive infinity, into a bounded output between 0 and 1. This characteristic makes it extremely useful in the output layer of networks performing binary classification, as the output can be directly interpreted as a probability. Finally, the tan, or hyperbolic tangent function, is mathematically similar to the sigmoid, but maps the input range to an output between -1 and 1. Because its output is 0-centered, meaning its average output is closer to 0, tan can sometimes help certain optimization algorithms converge faster than sigmoid. While ReLU is dominant in hidden layers, sigmoid and tan are still frequently used in specific contexts, particularly in recurrent or output layers where bounded, interpretable outputs are needed. Once the signal has passed through the weighted layers and nonlinear activations, the network generates its final raw outputs. However, for a classification task, these raw outputs are just scores. A higher score is better, but it is not a probability we can interpret as confidence. We need a final step, the final translation, from raw scores to confident probabilities. Look at the left graph, showing the network outputs scores for a simple classification task, cat, dog, bird. The dog score is 4.1, which is clearly the highest, but what does 4.1 mean? Does it mean 41% or 90% confidence? We can't tell. To transform these raw, unbounded scores into meaningful confidence levels, we apply the softmax function to the final layer. Unlike the activation functions we discussed earlier, softmax is a special operation applied simultaneously to all output neuron scores together. The softmax function takes these scores and transforms them into a true probability distribution, as shown in the right graph, final probabilities. It has 2 key mathematical properties that are vital for classification. 1. All outputs are strictly between 0 and 1, and 2. All outputs sum exactly to 1. This means the probabilities are mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive, allowing us to interpret them as confidence levels. Crucially, softmax also slightly exaggerates the highest score. 4.1 became 73%, making the network's most confident prediction stand out even more clearly. This exaggeration is a form of normalization that greatly aids in training and final interpretation. We have now explored all the fundamental components and mathematical principles required to build a functioning, modern deep learning system. This slide, the artificial mind assembled, brings all these pieces together. Starting with the raw data and on the left, the information flows through the input layer. We then move through deep, fully connected layers, hidden layer 1 and hidden layer 2. The core computational power resides inside each neuron, which is now a modern processing unit. Recall the components within the blue circle, representing a single neuron's operation. Weighted inputs are summed, a bias is added to shift the decision boundary, and then a ReLU activation, or another nonlinear function, is applied. This nonlinearity is the secret ingredient that prevents the network from collapsing into a single, linear perceptron. By arranging these modern neurons into deep, feed-forward layers, we create a system that can avoid the fatal flaws of the past and learn to represent extremely complex patterns hierarchically in data. The first hidden layer might learn simple features, the second learns combinations of those features, and so on. Finally, the signal reaches the output layer, where the softmax function is applied to convert the raw scores into meaningful class probabilities. The result is not a brain in the biological sense, but a highly sophisticated, hierarchical information processor. This architecture, the deep, feed-forward neural network, is the foundation of nearly all modern machine learning successes, proving that powerful intelligence can emerge from the organized assembly of simple, nonlinear mathematical building blocks.